The sky above District 7 was always rust-red like dried blood, thick with the smoke of dying reactors and forgotten wars. The air tasted like iron and rain, always humid, always heavy. Between the towers of black steel and broken glass, the alleys twisted like scars, narrow, winding places where the city pretended not to feel. And in one of those alleys, something stirred. Kael Varen walked with his head down, his coat thin and ragged, patched in 3 places with fabric that didn't match. His boots were cracked. His hands were calloused. And his eyes had forgotten what it meant to dream. The city didn't hate him. It simply didn't care. He was human. That was enough to be invisible here. He moved through the lower zone like a shadow, weaving past exhaust vents and neon signs half lit with flickering alien symbols. The other species never spoke to him. They passed with glances sharp as blades, shoulders cold as the glass towers above. Kael had grown used to it. He no longer expected kindness, or warmth, or a reason to look up, until he heard the sound. Software metallic. Dragging. He stopped. It came again, from a gap between 2 collapsed vents, near a pile of broken crates and discarded synth wiring. A place even the rats had abandoned. Kael turned toward it, eyes narrowing. The air was colder here. Still. He stepped closer. Then he heard a whisper. "Go away, please." The voice was quiet, fractured, not angry, not desperate. Just finished. Kael moved into the shadowed space. What he saw there made his breath catch. She was curled against the wall like a forgotten doll, half buried beneath cloth and machine scraps. Her skin shimmered faintly, not human. Pale silver blue, bruised in places. Her eyes, large and luminous, glowed faint green in the dark. Her hair was long and tangled, streaked with grease and soot. But it wasn't her face that stunned him. It was the fact that she had no legs. Her body ended at the waist, replaced by a tangle of burnt wires, synthetic tubing, and metal connectors sparking faintly with dying power. She was barely breathing, not crying, just waiting. Kael knelt slowly, not touching her. She opened her eyes again, staring at him. "You're human. Yes, you shouldn't be here. If they see you, they'll hurt you too." Kael looked around. The alley was empty, no cameras, no drones, just shadows and silence. "Who did this to you?" She didn't answer. He studied her face. Beneath the grime and exhaustion, she was young, no more than 20, if her species aged anything like his. But her expression, there was something ancient in her eyes, like she had already lived through endings. "What's your name?" She hesitated. "Elira." He nodded. "My name's Kael." She flinched slightly when he reached for his coat, but he moved slow, careful. He wrapped it around her. Her skin was cold. Too cold. "You need help. No help. Just go. You don't understand. I'm not supposed to be alive." Kael ignored her words. He gently lifted her into his arms. She was light. Unnaturally light. As he carried her out of the alley, she whispered one last thing into the hollow space between them. "You shouldn't have done this." "Why?" "Because now, they'll come for you too." And above them, somewhere high in the city's endless maze of metal and flame, something old stirred at the sound of her name being spoken again. Something that had waited for her to die. But now, it would have to wake up and chase. The rain fell in slow sheets, a cold metallic drizzle that slid down Kael's coat as he ducked through the broken maintenance hatch behind Tower C3. It was the only way into the human quarter now. What was left of it? The main gate had been sealed off months ago after another incident no one bothered to investigate. No one cared what happened down here. That was what made it safe. Kael carried Elira in both arms, his jaw clenched, eyes forward. She was wrapped in his coat, but still trembling. Her skin had taken on a duller shade of blue, and every so often her hands twitched involuntarily. Her breathing was shallow but steady. He whispered nothing, just kept walking. The corridor reeked of rust and damp oil. Flickering yellow lights blinked overhead like failing stars. They passed shattered signs that once held names of humans who no longer existed. Finally, Kael reached his door. It hissed open with a tired groan. Inside, the room was small, barely wide enough for a bed, a dented table, and a broken screen embedded into the wall. A cracked heater buzzed quietly in the corner, its warmth faint but better than the cold outside. On the walls, old cloths were draped over pipes to keep the moisture off. Nothing here was beautiful, but everything had survived. He laid Elira gently on the bed. She did not resist. Kael moved quickly. He poured warm water from a canister into a cracked cup, then set it by her side. He pulled the blanket tighter around her. She stared up at the ceiling, lips slightly parted, breath trembling. "You're safe," he said. She didn't respond. But her eyes shifted, just slightly toward him. Kael stepped back and crouched near the old medkit beneath the table. It was dusty, but intact. He rummaged through it until he found a basic tool set, a heat clamp, and a low-dose stim injector. As he turned back, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. The wires in her lower body. They were moving, not twitching. Moving. Slow, delicate motions like tendrils reacting to the room. He froze. Elira noticed his stare. "Don't touch them." Her voice was firmer this time. "They're alive." Kael stared, unsure if she meant metaphorically. "They listen," she said. "When I sleep, they shift, like they're dreaming, but not my dreams." He set the tools down carefully. "Okay, I won't touch them." She relaxed slightly. Kael sat on the floor across from her, knees pulled up. He glanced at the cable near her spine. Something about it was different. Not just tech. It had markings etched into its surface. Not any language he knew, not machine code. Symbols, like something religious. "Do you know what they put in you?" Elira closed her eyes. "A mistake. A core. They said it was ancient, that it had no business waking. They put it in me when I was too young to understand, and when I failed the test, they threw me away." Kael's voice dropped. "What kind of test?" "Survive. Interface. Obey." He felt something tighten in his chest. That word. Obey. He stood and stepped toward the screen on the wall, meaning to patch the broken wire. Then the lights flickered. The screen buzzed, came alive. A symbol flashed once, then a single word appeared on the screen. Contact. Kael turned to Elira. She sat upright, eyes wide. "What did you do?" "I didn't." He stopped himself. "When I touched the wires, maybe." She closed her eyes, breathing faster. "It sent a signal. It always does. A beacon." Kael cursed under his breath. "Who will answer it?" She looked at him. "The ones who made me." Outside, in the distance, a low rumble echoed through the pipes. Then a second one, closer. Sirens began to rise in the lower sectors. Faint, distant, but real. "They're coming," she whispered. "Not to kill me, to take me back." Kael moved across the room, opened the drawer, and pulled out the small blaster he kept hidden. His hands didn't shake. "Not happening," he said. Elira's voice was quiet now. "You don't understand. I'm not special. I'm a failed experiment. They will erase everything to hide what I am." "You're not a thing," Kael said. "You're a person." The lights above them buzzed harder. The power flickered. From the hallway came a sound like static grinding against metal. "They're here." Elira reached under her torn harness and pulled out a small crystal, softly glowing blue. "What's that?" "The only piece I kept. The voice of the one who built me, before they erased him too." The door lock sparked, then hissed. Kael raised the blaster. "Stay behind me." But Elira shook her head. "Number, you don't get it. If they mark you for knowing me, they'll never stop." Kael didn't look back. His voice was steady. "I'd rather be hunted than be alone again." And when the door finally exploded inward, neither of them ran. They stood side by side, and the city above them began to wake. The door shattered in a spray of sparks and smoke. The blast threw Kael back a step, shielding Elira with his body, as the corridor outside lit up with the pulse of synthetic light. A single drone hovered in the opening, silent and precise. Its surface was matte black, shaped like a floating blade, with a single red sensor glowing in the center like a pupil that never blinked. Kael raised the blaster. The drone scanned the room. A faint pulse flickered across its surface. It ignored the bed, the table, the dying heater. Then it turned to Elira. She didn't move. "Don't let it speak," she whispered. "If it sends a confirmation, more will come, worse than it." Kael didn't hesitate. He fired. The blaster lit up the room in a flash of blue. The shot struck the drone dead center. It cracked, sparked, and dropped like a stone, crashing to the floor with a hiss of broken circuitry. Kael exhaled, then turned to Elira. Too late. Her eyes were wide, locked on the blinking red light still pulsing from inside the drone's broken core. "It already sent it," she said softly. Above them, the lights in the ceiling turned red. A long siren groaned in the pipes. The city had noticed. Kael grabbed his pack, stuffed the medkit and the crystal into it, then moved to her. "Can you hold on?" She gave him the ghost of a smile. "I've survived worse." He lifted her into his arms, again feeling just how little weight she carried. Her body was tense, eyes scanning every shadow. The air outside the apartment was thicker now, charged with something heavy, mechanical, unseen. The silence was louder than footsteps. As Kael stepped into the corridor, the hallway lights flickered and then dimmed. Emergency protocols had been triggered. That meant the city was locking down. "They're moving fast," Elira murmured. "Who?" "Sky Hunters." Kael blinked. He had heard the name in whispers, in old refugee bars buried in rumors. Erasure agents, not soldiers, not law, just cleanup. The final hand that closed after the damage was done. "What do they want?" "Not to kill me," she said, "to erase me, to shut off the signal." "And you touched the core. They'll mark you too." Kael gritted his teeth. "Let them try." He turned left, cutting through a service shaft. Rusted pipes dripped around them. The air smelled of burnt coolant and old metal. Elira's breathing was shallow now, and she winced as the metal of her lower half brushed against his coat. "Where are we going?" she asked. "A workshop. Near the Montreal lines. Old smuggler zone. I know a guy." She nodded, trusting him. Above them, the sound came again. Click, click, click. Not footsteps, claws. They were being tracked. Kael moved faster, weaving through maintenance tunnels he hadn't used in years. Every few feet, the lights behind them popped and died. The power grid was shutting off in their wake. They were being herded. How far? Not far. Elira's voice was weaker now. "They activated something else," she said. "A deeper protocol. I can feel it. The city's not just searching, it's watching." He didn't ask what she meant. He saw it in her face. Whatever tech they had buried inside her, it wasn't done waking up. They reached the rusted transit station just as another clawed sound echoed behind them. Kael kicked the door open, staggered inside. The station was ancient, screens cracked, floor half-flooded. A large hologram flickered weakly above. "Welcome to Transit Hub 12, it said in a cheerful, broken voice. He placed her on a bench, trying to catch his breath. "I'll find a way out," he said. Elira grabbed his wrist. "If I die, they'll stop hunting you." Kael shook his head. "I'd rather be hunted than be alone again." She blinked. Something cracked behind her expression. Not fear, not pain. Wonder. "Why are you like this?" "Because I used to ask that question too." Then the roof exploded. Steel rained down. From the hole above, a shape dropped. Tall, fast, seamless. The first Sky Hunter. Its limbs were a mixture of metal, black flesh, and exposed bone. Its head was eyeless, a smooth faceplate with a single red strip glowing across it. Kael raised the blaster. It moved faster than sight. The weapon flew from his hand. He ducked, barely avoiding a claw that sliced through the bench. Elira screamed. The Sky Hunter turned toward her. Kael launched himself at it, but he was too slow, The Sky Hunter's arm raised, claws pointed at Elira's chest. Then the light came. A burst of blue energy erupted from Elira's body. The Sky Hunter flew across the room, slamming into the wall. The impact cracked stone. Kael stared. Elira stood. Her legs, metal, glowing, alive, extended beneath her. The wires in her waist moved like a second spine, defensive limbs flaring. "You're standing." She looked down, amazed. Her voice was steady. "I wasn't supposed to walk again." "But you changed that." The Sky Hunter roared. Elira raised her hand. A thin beam of energy lanced through the air and pierced the Sky Hunter's core. It collapsed, smoke trailing from its chest. The light in Elira faded. Her knees buckled. Kael caught her. "Why did you do that?" She smiled faintly. "Because you looked at me like I mattered." Outside, the next wave approached. In the dark, someone whispered, "The human has awakened her core. Begin planetary lockdown." And above them, stars began to move. The transit station was a hollow relic of a bygone age. Broken screens, rusted rails, and debris strewn across the floor like forgotten memories. The air smelled of dust and decay, a thick, musty scent that clung to the walls. The dim lighting flickered weakly above, casting long shadows in the corners, hiding more than it revealed. It was quiet here, abandoned. But not for long. Kael and Elira had barely caught their breath when the sound came. An electric hum that vibrated through the station, followed by the unmistakable click of metal against concrete. Kael turned just in time to see the shadow in the distance, a sleek, dark form moving fast through the low light. A Sky Hunter. Elira didn't have time to react before the creature was on them. It was a blur of black metal and sinewy flesh, faster than anything Kael had ever seen. Its eyes, no, its face, was smooth, blank, except for the single red sensor strip that flickered with cold, calculating precision. It had no intention of talking. It wanted Elira. Kael barely had time to raise his blaster before the creature leapt, swiping at him with its clawed arm. The impact sent him flying backward, slamming into the steel wall with a grunt, his vision blurring for a second. He pushed himself up, but his hands were shaking. His pulse was racing. That thing had nearly ended him. He could see it moving toward Elira now, its body coiling, preparing for the final strike. "No," Kael muttered, forcing his legs to move. His blaster was still out of reach. There was nothing he could do. He wasn't fast enough. But then, something changed. The air around Elira began to shimmer, as if reality itself was bending. She sat still, her hands clenched at her sides, breathing shallow. Her body, frail just moments ago, now seemed to pulse with a strange energy, raw, potent. Kael froze as a low hum filled the room, rising in pitch. Elira's skin began to glow, a soft blue light that pulsed with life, like the core of a star. The metallic wiring and tubes at her waist shifted and retracted as though they were alive, transforming, reshaping, forming legs beneath her. Legs made of shimmering metal that gleamed with an unnatural light. Her body trembled, every movement slow and painful as the energy built inside her, her eyes glowing brighter. Then, in one fluid motion, she stood. Kael's heart skipped a beat. Elira was standing on her own, her once broken body now restored, her eyes filled with determination. The Sky Hunter had paused for a moment, its sensor flickering as it adjusted to the unexpected sight. Kael watched in awe, his breath catching in his throat. Elira took a step forward, and the entire room seemed to shift with the weight of her newfound power. She raised her hand. A surge of energy shot from her, a beam of light that collided with the Sky Hunter's chest, sending it flying backward. The machine let out a screech, but it was cut off as its body crumpled against the far wall, sparks flying from its broken parts. Kael stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, staring at the destruction she had just caused. Elira stood there, her chest rising and falling rapidly, the blue light in her veins dimming as the energy drained from her body. She collapsed to her knees, her legs buckling beneath her. The glow faded completely, leaving her as fragile as she had been before. Kael rushed to her side, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached out, catching her before she hit the cold floor. "Elira," he whispered, voice shaking. "What just happened?" Her lips parted, barely able to form words. You made me believe I still had value." Her voice trembled, like a sound that didn't belong to this world, fragile and full of pain. Kael's heart ached as he held her close, not knowing what to say. "You do," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You always did." The sound of sirens blared in the distance, growing louder. The Sky Hunter had not been the only one. Kael didn't have time to wonder what the hell had just happened. He picked her up again, his arms tightening around her. There was no time left for questions. They were coming. The real hunt was about to begin. As Kael carried her toward the exit, Elira's hand brushed against his chest. "Stay with me," she whispered. Kael nodded. "Always." They ran, disappearing into the darkness of the tunnels, leaving behind a broken machine and the promise of a fight that had just begun. The old workshop was a stark contrast to the sleek, cold city. The air inside was thick with the smell of metal and oil, and the walls were lined with machines, half-disassembled parts, and forgotten projects. The lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows over the room filled with clutter. In the corner, a tall alien with 6 mechanical arms stood hunched over a workbench, welding together something that looked like a fusion of metal and flesh. His name was Corin, a reclusive engineer with a dark past, someone who owed Kael more than a few debts. Kael had once helped Corin escape a tight situation, and now the favor was being returned. They had no other options. This place, hidden deep within the Undercity, was the only sanctuary where they could make a stand. But as they entered, Kael felt the weight of time and danger pressing on them. Corin looked up from his work, his welding mask reflecting the dim light. When he saw Elira, a flash of surprise crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by calculation. "Kael," Corin said, in a voice that sounded like grinding gears. "I didn't expect company, and certainly not her." "She needs help," Kael replied. His voice was steady, but beneath it was the growing fear that everything they were running from would catch up with them soon. "Can you fix her?" Corin didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to Elira, examining her carefully. He placed a metal hand on her shoulder, his mechanical eyes glowing faintly as he scanned her body. His face remained unreadable, but Kael could tell he was making quick calculations in his mind. Corin nodded after a long pause. "It can be done, but I'm going to need parts. And time." "I don't have much of either," Kael said, glancing at the door. They weren't safe yet. Corin waved him off. "Don't worry, I work fast." He looked over his shoulder and gestured toward a corner of the workshop where piles of metal and scrap had been gathered. "I'll need to repurpose some of this. I think I can get her something functional." Kael set Elira down on a nearby workbench, the weight of her fragile body making him wince as he gently laid her down. Her eyes were half closed, but there was still a flicker of awareness in them. "I'll be here," Kael said softly to her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I won't leave you." Elira nodded faintly but said nothing. She was exhausted, her body still flickering with the after effects of the energy she had unleashed. Kael watched as Corin began pulling apart various mechanical parts and reassembling them into something new, his multiple arms moving in synchronized precision. Time passed in a blur of clinking tools and quiet murmurs. Kael stayed by Elira's side, his mind racing. The world outside was closing in, and they couldn't afford to stay in one place for long. The drone's signal had been sent, and their location was probably already being tracked. But here, in the dim light of Corin's workshop, time felt like it slowed. Kael couldn't help but watch as Corin carefully shaped the metal, bending it with expert hands to create a set of legs that could function in Elira's fragile state. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Corin stepped back, wiping his hands on a rag. "She's ready." Kael walked over to Elira, his breath caught in his throat as he gazed down at the new mechanical legs that had been grafted to her lower body. They were sleek, shiny metal with intricate designs. They weren't the legs of a human, but they were something far more intricate, an amalgamation of alien technology and human ingenuity. Corin turned to Kael, nodding. They're functional, strong enough to support her, but she'll need time to adjust. I can't promise it'll be easy. Kael nodded in understanding. He looked down at Elira, her body trembling slightly, and took her hand. Elira, can you hear me? Her eyelids fluttered and she looked up at him. There was a hint of recognition in her gaze. She lifted her head slightly and looked at the new legs. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal, her touch tentative. They're real? Her voice was weak, a whisper, but Kael could hear the disbelief in her tone. They're real, Kael said gently, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. Try moving them. Elira hesitated, her body stiff with uncertainty. Then, slowly, she attempted to lift one leg. At first, it was shaky, awkward, but after a few moments, she gained a bit of control. She lifted both legs and, with a careful step, lowered them to the floor. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Her body wavered, but she stood. Kael couldn't help the surge of relief that flooded through him. She was standing again. I'm standing, she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. Kael smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in days. You are. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of what had happened, what they were about to face, still loomed large. But in this moment, there was only the quiet miracle of her standing, of her surviving, of the strength that was growing inside her. Corin stepped forward, his expression unreadable behind his welding mask. He cleared his throat. Don't get too sentimental yet. There's more work to be done, he said gruffly. The real problem's coming. You're going to need to move fast. Kael turned to face him, his thoughts snapping back to the reality of their situation. Right, Kael said. He helped Elira steady herself. We'll move fast. Elira's eyes flickered as she took a step forward, the weight of her new legs grounding her in the moment. And then, with a final glance at the workshop, at the makeshift home they had just begun to build, the three of them stepped out into the unknown. The city outside was still waiting, and now they had a plan. But the path ahead would not be easy, and they would face whatever came next together. The moon station was buried deep in silence. The air felt thicker here, unnaturally still, like the calm before a storm. Elira and Kael moved through the labyrinth of corridors, stepping carefully over cracks in the floor and debris that had been untouched for centuries. The station had been dormant, a forgotten relic from a time long past. But as they ventured deeper, something hummed beneath their feet. Something powerful, something alive. The walls around them were lined with ancient panels, many covered in alien symbols Kael didn't recognize. There were no windows, only faint lights flickering intermittently overhead. In the center of the station was a massive circular room, the floor cracked and covered with dust. At the center of this room stood a large terminal, a pulsing blue core that seemed to be waiting for them. Here, Elira whispered, her voice reverberating off the walls. She stepped forward, her legs moving more fluidly now, her confidence growing with each step. She had come alive in ways Kael couldn't fully comprehend. But one thing was clear. She was no longer the broken girl he had found in the alley. This is it, she said, the heart of everything. Kael watched her closely. What is this place? This, Elira said softly, is where it all began. The Starborn civilization. This is their map, how they saw the universe. She gestured toward a glowing screen embedded into the floor. Slowly, it began to display a map, each star marked with symbols Kael didn't understand. They stretched across galaxies, spanning light years. This is your people's history, Kael asked. Elira nodded. Our creators. Our people. They were once the masters of the stars, until war broke them. Until the war for the core destroyed everything. Kael frowned. The core? What's that? She pointed to the terminal. The core isn't just a thing, Kael. It's a power. A living energy that can reshape entire worlds, create life, destroy it. The Starborn used it to control everything. But when they were done, they sealed it away. Hidden inside me. Kael's heart sank. You're saying, the core is inside you? Elira nodded, her eyes glistening with something close to regret. Yes, but I wasn't supposed to live with it. They wanted to destroy me, erase me. But the core, it chose me. I became its vessel. Kael stared at her in disbelief. And now you're telling me that we're connected to all of this? She turned to face him. Her voice was calm but firm. We are. The core has chosen us. You, Kael, are something called a human prime. You carry the genes that can unlock the core's full potential. You were created for this. Kael stumbled back slightly, his mind spinning. What do you mean created? The Starborn engineered humans for a purpose, to protect us, to protect the core. Elira's eyes searched his, dark and filled with an ancient sorrow. They made you, Kael. You're a living weapon, a guardian meant to protect the last of us. He took a step back, the weight of her words settling like a heavy fog in his chest. I was born for this? His voice was hoarse, trying to come to terms with the impossibility of it all. She nodded. The core has been waiting for you. For both of us. Before Kael could process this new revelation, a deep rumble echoed through the station, the ground vibrating beneath their feet. Elira's eyes shot wide open. They've found us, she whispered. Kael's instincts kicked in. He reached for his blaster, readying himself, but Elira stopped him with a hand on his arm. We don't have time for that now. They'll come for the core. They'll come for me. As if on cue, a loud boom reverberated through the walls, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. They're here, Kael said, his voice filled with urgency. They're not coming for you. They're coming for the core, Elira said. And if they take it, everything we fought for, everything we've done, will be for nothing. Kael looked at her, determination flooding through his veins. Then we fight. Together. Elira took a deep breath, the energy in the room shifting. The core beneath her feet pulsed, and she closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her strength. The energy surrounding them began to glow, pulsing like a heartbeat. Kael could feel it in his chest, a resonance that was both alien and familiar. He could feel the power coursing through him, as if the core was awakening in him too. The sound of heavy boots grew louder, echoing down the hall. Elira's body began to glow, not with the same fragile light from before, but with an intensity that lit up the room. Her legs, now fully functional, moved with confidence as she stepped forward. This is it, she said. This is where we end it. Kael stood beside her, his body tense. The door to the room burst open, and a flood of heavily armored soldiers flooded in, their weapons raised. But they weren't prepared for the light that flooded the room. With a single gesture, Elira sent a wave of pure energy toward them, blasting them back. The soldiers screamed, but the force was too powerful. They crumpled against the walls, their bodies smoking, before they hit the ground. The room was now alive with power. Elira, no! Kael shouted as he saw her sway, her body glowing brighter than ever. The energy coming from her was overwhelming, too much for her fragile form to sustain. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. I have to, she whispered, her voice strained. I have to make them understand. More soldiers poured in, this time with heavier armor, their weapons locking on her. Kael stepped forward, raising his blaster to fire, but Elira stopped him with a look. Her eyes glowed brightly and the soldiers froze, their movements stiffening. Leave. Now, she commanded. The soldiers didn't move. The energy from her body swelled again, and Kael felt his own body humming with the same power, like an electric current passing through him. He was no longer just Kael Varen. He was part of this. A guardian. The soldiers' weapons powered down, their minds locked by Elira's will. They had no choice but to leave, one by one, stumbling away in confusion. Elira lowered her hand, the light fading as the room grew silent again. Kael stood beside her, his heart pounding in his chest. We did it. But Elira was breathing heavily, her body trembling from the effort. Not yet, she whispered. This is only the beginning. Outside the station, the battle for the core was far from over. But now, they had awakened something far greater than they had ever imagined. And Kael knew, for the first time in his life, he wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for the future of everything. The surface of the moon was silent. Its cold, barren expanse stretched endlessly, broken only by the occasional shadow of a crater or a ridge. The air was still, as it had been for millennia. Below, beneath layers of frozen dust and ancient rock, something stirred. Kael and Elira stood at the entrance of a massive hidden cavern, the ground beneath them trembling with an unseen power. A subtle hum filled the air, vibrating through the soles of their boots. They exchanged a glance, both of them sensing it. The ship had begun to awaken. "Elira," Kael breathed, his voice tight with awe and fear. This is it." She nodded, her glowing eyes reflecting the dim light from the cavern walls. "This is the Starborn ship," she said quietly, her voice filled with reverence. "The vessel that once carried the last of my people. It's alive. More than a ship. It's a living organism, built to protect the core, to protect me." The entrance before them began to glow faintly, lines of blue light tracing along the metal-like veins, pulsing with the life of the ship. Slowly, the massive doors began to open, revealing the ship inside. It was unlike any vessel Kael had ever seen. It wasn't made of rigid steel or plastic, but of something more organic, curved flowing lines that resembled the inside of a living creature. The surface shimmered like liquid silver, reflecting the dim light from above, and the walls seemed to pulse with energy. It was a fusion of biology and technology, ancient and yet pulsing with an eerie, almost sentient energy. As they stepped forward, the ship seemed to respond. The walls shifted, expanding, welcoming them. The ship recognized them. A voice, soft and deep, echoed through the air, not from the walls but from within Kael's mind. The voice was ancient and yet familiar, filled with warmth and understanding. Human prime and core bearer detected. Connection confirmed. Awakening sequence complete. Kael froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The voice. It had recognized him. "Human prime," Kael whispered, turning to Elira, his voice full of confusion. "What does that mean?" Elira's expression darkened for a moment. "It means you were created for this, created to protect the core. Your genes, your DNA, they were designed to safeguard what remains of the Starborn civilization." Her gaze softened, and she placed a hand on his arm. "I told you, Kael. You were never just anyone." Kael's mind raced, the weight of her words sinking in. He wasn't just a random human. He was connected to something far greater, something that had been hidden from him for a reason. The ship had recognized him, not as a mere traveler, but as something with a greater purpose. Before he could ask more questions, the sound of engines vibrated through the ship. A low hum filled the air. Elira's eyes widened. "They found us. The enemy ships. They're closing in." Kael's stomach twisted. "We don't have time to wait for them to board us." The ship responded to Elira's voice. A single flash of blue light surged through the control center, filling the space with an unearthly glow. The walls began to shift again, revealing a central core that pulsed with energy. The ship began to take shape, as if it were fully awakening, recognizing its passengers. "I'm not a weapon," Elira said, her voice low but steady, her face serious. "I am the light, not the blade, and I won't let them turn me into one." Kael nodded, determination flashing in his eyes. "Then let's take control of the ship." Elira stepped forward, her hands reaching for the core of the ship, her energy flowing into the ancient vessel. Kael stood beside her, watching as the walls of the ship seemed to respond to her touch. The energy coursing through her body connected with the ship, unlocking its systems. She was no longer just a passenger, she was in command. Kael didn't fully understand what was happening, but as he watched Elira, he knew. She wasn't just a survivor anymore, she was a force that would change everything. Suddenly, the ship's internal systems activated. Lights flashed brighter. The engines roared to life, sending a shockwave of energy across the surface of the moon. Kael turned toward the door. Through the entrance, he could see the enemy ships, massive, dark warships, their weapons aimed directly at them. The Starborn ship began to lift off the ground. "Get ready," Elira said, her voice steady. "We're not running. We're not hiding. We're taking control." Kael nodded, feeling the ship's power growing, flowing through him, through Elira. The two of them were now bound together with the ship, their purpose clear. As the ships outside fired their first salvo, the Starborn ship surged forward with incredible speed. It didn't dodge, it didn't evade. Instead, it embraced the attack. The enemy's weapons collided with the ship, but nothing happened. The blasts simply absorbed into the ship's energy field, dissipating harmlessly. "This is the way it's supposed to be," Elira whispered. "We control the power now." With a swift motion, Elira guided the ship's energy. The Starborn ship's wings unfolded, massive, powerful, glowing with the intensity of 1,000 suns. The ship moved faster than Kael's eyes could follow, cutting through the darkness like a comet, leaving the enemy ships in its wake. One by one, the enemy warships fell behind, their weapons useless, their systems failing. The Starborn ship moved in ways that Kael could never have imagined. A weapon, yes, but one of peace. It wasn't destroying, it was controlling, rewriting the rules of the game. The leader of the enemy fleet, on the bridge of his flagship, watched the Starborn ship with growing fear. He shouted orders to his crew, but they were too late. "Activate the planetary lockdown," the commander barked, his voice filled with rage. "Don't let them escape." But it was already too late. Elira raised her hand, and the ship responded. The fleet was gone. The Starborn ship was unstoppable. Kael looked at Elira, who stood beside him, her eyes glowing bright with energy. "We're not done yet," she said, her voice full of resolve. Kael smiled, feeling the same fire burning inside him. "Let's finish what they started." Together, they had just taken control of a weapon that had been forgotten for centuries. Together, they would reshape the future. The ship glided through the void, silent and graceful as it cut across the fabric of space. The stars outside were distant pinpricks of light, cold and unreachable. But inside the Starborn ship, there was warmth. It was the first time in a long while that Kael and Elira could truly relax. They had come far, past battles, past betrayals, past their own limits. Now, for the first time, they had a moment of peace. Elira sat near the observation window, her eyes still glowing softly. The blue energy that had surged through her in moments of crisis had faded, but there was a new calmness in her. She was no longer the fragile girl Kael had found on the cold streets, waiting for death. She had become something more, something that both terrified and inspired the galaxy. Kael leaned against the wall, looking at her, his eyes full of awe. She wasn't just the girl who had survived. They were both survivors. Together, they had woken the core of a forgotten civilization, controlled a ship that could shatter fleets, and face down an entire army. Elira turned to him, catching his gaze. "You never asked me what happened before they found me." Kael shook his head. "I didn't need to. You've been through enough. I'll let you tell me when you're ready." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "It's not that. It's just, I never thought I would have the chance to tell anyone." The ship hummed gently beneath them, as if listening to her words. The stars outside flickered, distant and cold. She sighed, looking back out into the cosmos. "My people," she began, her voice soft. "We were once the keepers of the stars. We traveled across galaxies, building and learning. But we were arrogant. We thought we could control everything, life, death, the stars themselves. And then we found the core, the heart of the universe. It gave us power beyond measure. But we misused it. We destroyed each other." Kael walked over to her, listening carefully. "So, the war? It wasn't just about survival?" "No," she replied quietly. "It was about greed. We were consumed by it. The core wasn't meant to be controlled, it was meant to guide us, to be a part of us. But we wanted to wield it. We thought it would make us gods." "Then the war happened," Kael said, more of a statement than a question. Elira nodded. "The core was locked away, hidden beneath layers of ice and technology. I was created to be its protector, its keeper. But they never intended for me to live this long. I was a failure, discarded when I broke. Kael stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. You're not a failure, Elira. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. You really believe that, don't you? I do, he said, smiling softly. You showed me that. You're not broken. You're stronger than anything I've ever known. The ship's systems chimed, a soft melodic hum vibrating through the walls. A new voice, calm and reassuring, echoed in their minds. Core initialization complete. Pathway to Earth secured. Continuing journey. Elira's eyes narrowed, and Kael felt a flicker of tension in her body. Earth, she whispered, her voice distant. I never thought I would see it again. The voice continued, but this time with a note of finality. Human Prime and Core Bearer acknowledged. No longer fugitives. A new beginning awaits. They were no longer just survivors. They were the beginning of something new. They had the power to reshape the galaxy, to break the cycles of destruction that had plagued their worlds for centuries. Kael looked out the window, his eyes reflecting the vast expanse of space. Do you think we can do it? Elira's gaze softened, the weight of her past lifting. We've already done it. The ship's engines hummed louder, and Kael felt a pull, something ancient and powerful within him. He glanced at her, his eyes full of understanding. Whatever was coming next, they would face it together. Not as enemies of the galaxy, not as survivors of the past, but as people who had chosen to change the future. Outside the window, Earth loomed large, its blue and green surface glowing like a jewel in the vast dark sea of space. Elira stepped closer, her hand brushing against his. She didn't say anything, but the unspoken bond between them was clear. They were no longer just two broken beings. They were the stars that would guide the galaxy forward. The voice from the ship echoed one last time, almost like a whisper. No one ever believed in you. But you believed in each other. And with that, the stars outside shone brighter. What would you do if the world you knew was crumbling around you? Would you fight to rebuild it or let it fall apart? Tell us in the comments. This story is far from over, and the choice is yours to make too.